Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Michael Barsanti. I am the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight, both those of you here at the American Philosophical Society and those of you online, to our lecture in honor of John Van Horne. This is my fifth lecture in honor of John Van Horne, and at this moment in the evening I have my tradition of remembering my first lecture in honor of John Van Horne, in which I very eagerly and energetically welcomed everyone to the lecture in memory of John Van Horne. I haven't forgot it. You haven't forgot it. Certainly John hasn't forgot it, but he's very patient with me. In this and in many other things. I want to thank the American Philosophical Society for hosting us tonight and for letting us use this wonderful room. I see Bob Hauser is here from the APS, and Patrick Spiro, and Kyle, and a number of our friends from APS. We're really grateful for them allowing us to use this space and for all of the ways in which the American Philosophical Society has been a wonderful partner to the Library Company. I also want to thank another co-sponsor for tonight, the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. Babak Safri from, I'm sorry, I just mangled your last name, Babak, excuse me, but we know you and love you as Babak, is here from the Consortium. And thank you for co-sponsoring tonight. Certainly a very appropriate event. One of the things we got to do today was to see the APS's new exhibition that just opened called Becoming Weatherwise. The exhibition is a really wonderful selection, beautifully curated exhibition. It also includes a really spectacular portrait of the subject of tonight's talk and some of his contributions to the practice of weather and to some of our attitudes relating to climate change and to our understanding of the unified environment we live in. This will be part of Clay's presentation shortly. I'm going to get out of the way very shortly, but before I do, it is my great pleasure. I will be welcoming the president of the board of the Library Company, Hal Rosenberg, up. Before I do, I do want to thank Clay Jenkinson for coming and giving this talk tonight. I have been hearing about Clay for several years. I remember having lunch with John shortly after he had been on one of Clay's tours, a Lewis and Clark tour out west, and describing the hike that he went on. But also just describing this remarkably charismatic, erudite, magnetic leader, and how we had to bring him to the Library Company because he was just so compelling a guide and a host. But it was also a strenuous hike, and I think Clay will probably say a little bit more about it now that the litigation has been resolved. Over the last 2 days, I've had the pleasure of escorting or being with Clay and with John for some of it through, I think, what can only be described as John's revenge on that hike, as we have looked at the remarkable collections from the American Philosophical Society at the University of Pennsylvania, of course, at our own Library Company of Philadelphia, the Academy of Natural Sciences, really a long march of books and cradles and glasses of wine that I hope, if Clay recovers, he will remember fondly. Certainly over the course of this time we've spent, this kind of cultural hike that he's been subjected to, we really began to feel about Clay that he was really illuminated by the same spirit that Franklin and the members of his junto had when they got together to talk, and this idea of bringing to life the intellectual debates, the pressing issues, bringing the history to us in a really vivid and living way. And so, Clay, I'm going to drag you up here early because I wanted to present you with something. So as John and I were talking about this, we thought what we really wanted to do is to give you a share in the library company.
Whoa.
So this is your own share. Thank you. So this is a share that belonged to Horace Howard Furness.
The furnace share.
This is the Furness share. Furness was a Shakespeare scholar. He and his father worked together on a variorum edition of Shakespeare. And as a Shakespeare scholar and a man lit by the great fire of Shakespeare himself, we thought this was a fitting one for you to have.
Hold or not to hold?
That is the question.
Thank you. Oh, I'm thrilled. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me now ask the president of the board of the library company, Howell Rosenberg, to come up. Hal has been a great friend of mine and a great supporter of the library company. And I think in many ways, Hal exemplifies in his passion for history, his passion for great history books and great interpretations of history. All that is best in library company shareholding is a model for us all. And tonight, I'd ask Hal to come up and introduce Clay Jenkinson for us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mike. Excellent. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. And welcome to our 8th annual lecture in honor of John Van Horne. Tonight's speaker is an historian, author, and a public humanities scholar. Clay Jenkinson graduated from the University of Minnesota, where he majored in English Renaissance literature. After he graduated from the University of Minnesota, he was named a Rhodes Scholar, and he received his MA from Oxford. He was also a Danforth Scholar. Now, if he looks familiar to you, and I know many of you were squinting and looking at him, and it wasn't just the coat that he's wearing, which, you know, as we all know, is probably an artifact from the time that I went to college, the Nehru jacket, very lovely, very great. But if he looks familiar to you, it may be because you saw him in a Ken Burns documentary. He appeared in 1997 in the Thomas Jefferson documentary that Ken Burns did. He appeared in 2009 in the National Parks documentary that Ken Burns did. In 2014, he appeared in the Roosevelts, and just recently, he appeared in the Benjamin Franklin documentary. He is, as you know, with Ken Burns, if you fail as a talking head the first time around, you're really not going to be asked for the rest. And he has been a great success in all of those appearances. But maybe you didn't see any of those documentaries. Maybe when you thought you recognized him, you were at the White House in 1994 when President Bill Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton hosted the first White House-sponsored presentation by a public humanities scholar, and that was Clay Jenkinson playing Thomas Jefferson. And maybe that's not where you saw him. Maybe you weren't at the White House in 1994. Maybe you recognize him from his appearances on the Today Show, Bill Maher's Politically Incorrect, Stephen Colbert Show. Or maybe you recognize him from the PBS special on Theodore Roosevelt's exploration of the River of Doubt. Or maybe you recognize him from the documentary films that he produced and starred in. Maybe about the one concerning the legacy of former North Dakota Congressman and Governor Art Link. But it's not just his appearances in the media that make him so great. He's an author of more than a dozen books covering a wide array of subjects, from Theodore Roosevelt to the Lewis and Clark expedition, to Meriwether Lewis, to the literature and history of epidemics, to the majesty of North Dakota, to Thomas Jefferson, and very rarely spoken in the same voice and the same sentence as Thomas Jefferson. He also wrote a book on Donald Trump. I don't think he praises him. He's a leader, as Mike told you, of cultural tours and retreats. They're all sold out. They all require applying for a waiting list. He does a tour of Jefferson's France, Cuba, and a retreat to discuss the brothers Karamazov and crime and punishment in some winter setting, which seems actually fascinating, but you can't get on that one either because that's also sold out. And of course, the trip that Mike described, the one that the Van Horns took, following in Lewis and Clark's footsteps. And at one point during that trip, I heard it directly from John and Chris yesterday, they were required to go without a shower for 3 days. And that wasn't the only deprivation of creature comforts that they suffered. The one thing that Clay Jenkinson likes to do is to make everybody feel as if they are doing the same things that the Corps of Discovery did back in the very beginning of the 19th century. And yet, notwithstanding that, they said it was one of the greatest experiences of their lives, and they recommend it to all. But you can't get on the trip because it's always booked up. But it sounds amazing. In 1989, he was selected by President George H.W. Bush to be one of the first 5 winners of our nation's highest honor in the humanities. He received the National Humanities Medal, and at that time it was called the Charles Frankel Prize. And he was one of 5, and among those 5 was the great historian Daniel Boorstin. Subsequent winners, people that were trying to get into the same club as Clay Jenkinson, turned out to be, and I'm just going to name a few, Ken Burns, David McCullough, Stephen Ambrose, Steven Spielberg, Toni Morrison, and many, many more names that you recognize, but they have only given me 10 minutes. The states of Nevada, Kansas, and North Dakota each honored him with their Humanities Scholar of the Year Award. He is the primary consultant to North Dakota's Dickinson State University Theodore Roosevelt Center, and he hosts nationally syndicated radio program, the Thomas Jefferson Hour, which is also available on podcast. I'm trying to give him a little push. He's a pioneer in the revival of the Chautauqua movement, and he's performed before thousands of people throughout this country. I believe he's performed in 49 states. And in his audiences, the audiences that he has performed before are Supreme Court justices, members of state legislatures, members of Congress, university students, and maximum security prisoners, which I believe also involves some of the members of Congress that he appeared before. For our speaker, in the words of the immortal bard, whose life and works he brilliantly portrays in his newest program, The Magic of the Word, an evening of Shakespeare's genius. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women are merely players, and one man in his time plays many parts. In his time, Clay Jenkinson has played Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, J. Robert Oppenheimer, John Steinbeck, Sir Francis Bacon, Sir Walter Raleigh, Jonathan Swift, William Shakespeare himself, John Steinbeck. And tonight, he will be presenting to us his talk about Thomas Jefferson and Alexander von Humboldt. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our 2022 Van Horne lecturer, Clay Jenkinson.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you. So, thank you, Hal. I'm sorry I fell asleep during the second half of that interview, but I think I caught the gist of it. Oh my, what an honor to be here. One of the great honors of my life, in fact. I was in some disbelief when I was asked to give this endowed lecture. I have such deep respect for all of you and for John Van Horne. So thank you. And I will give that talk here in a moment, but I want to clear up a few things about the famous trip. So Monticello called and said they wanted to buy the whole trip. They wanted to bring their people, and we would just host them and take them for 3 days canoeing on the White Cliffs section of the Missouri River, and then for 3 days up on the Lolo Trail, the passage through the Bitterroot Mountains that Lewis and Clark transacted in September of 1805. And we were thrilled, of course, and they were going to bring some of their board members and their CEO, Leslie Bowman, and some distinguished scholars. And of course, I was absolutely delighted by this. And the trip is extraordinarily enjoyable, so I hope you will all consider coming sometime. It's not as hard to get into as he says. And I was a little nervous to meet these eminent scholars and these high rollers from Monticello, but it's a strenuous trip. It's not for the faint of heart. And there's a hike up Wendover Mountain, which is 7 miles straight up. I mean, it's one of the hardest hikes I've ever been on, and I've hiked Mount Whitney. And so when I see a new group, I kind of look them over to get a sense of whether they can really hack it, you know? And I saw these types, and one of them, Oliver, wanted to go up the mountain in his loafers. And several of the Monticello board said, would there be strawberries and cream at the top? You know, and you kind of get the sense, you know? And then I looked at these scholars, Charles Cullen, John Van Horne, and they looked like people who've spent a lot of time studying documents. And so on the day of the famous hike, up we went, and it takes about 4.5 hours to climb this thing. And I got to the top in about 5 hours, and when you do, you have a beer and you lounge and boast that you are almost like Lewis and Clark. And so 5 hours went by, and then 6 hours went by, and now 6.5 hours went by, and they hadn't shown up yet. And they're somewhere on the mountain, and finally, the outfitter came to me and said, did you vet these people? He said, I think someone's broken a leg or fallen off the cliff. You better go back and check. And so it's about a mile back to the end of the trail, and I went down there, and I hallowed down and heard nothing, and waited an hour and a half and hallowed down. And then I thought, oh my God, I killed the Monticello board. I killed John Van Horne and Charles Cullen. This is going to hurt future sales. But they made it, and when people get up to the top, no matter how long it takes, it's one of the most splendid evenings you can ever have, because we've all tested ourselves against our own limitations, our sedentariness. You get up there, they have hors d'oeuvres waiting, our tents are set up, and we had some of the best conversations we've ever had because we had earned them. And that is just so wonderfully important. And I think of John and Charles Cullen, these eminent scholars, engaging in this kind of silly hike and then bringing their wisdom to all of us on top of that mountain. So I know you haven't forgotten it. I will never forget that time. And then we said, never again, you know. So let me give my talk. So if you would turn I have a few slides for you. So the title of my talk is A Tale of Two Cities, or Where is James Boswell When You Need Him? And I have three theses tonight that I just want to quickly outline for you, three themes. One is that Washington, D.C. is not and was not Philadelphia. That Philadelphia was, and in many respects still is, the cultural capital of the United States. I'm serious. And Washington wasn't, and in many respects still isn't. And secondly, and I'm a lover of Meriwether Lewis. I've written extensively about Lewis and Clark, and I do this annual trip every year. But Meriwether Lewis was a man of extraordinary capacity, but he was not Alexander von Humboldt. Alexander von Humboldt was one of the most extraordinary men of the modern age. And Lewis was terrific, but he was no Humboldt. And the third theme is that Charles Wilson Peale, whom I also deeply admire, was no James Boswell, as I will attempt to show you here. So let's begin. Historian Eleanor Jones Harvey has called it perhaps the most consequential visit by a European traveler in early American history. On May 24, 1804, the Prussian polymath, mining engineer, and explorer Alexander von Humboldt wrote a letter to the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Humboldt had spent the previous 5 years traveling in Central and South America, exploring parts of the southern continent that were still unknown to science. After ascending the arduous Orinoco River, climbing some of the highest peaks in the Western Hemisphere, including the 20,549-foot Mount Chimborazo, inventing the new science of plant geography, and spending nearly a year in the labyrinthine archives in Mexico City, Humboldt was exhausted and eager to get to Paris to begin sorting his notes, his maps, and artifacts for what in the next few decades would become a 30-volume Enlightenment publishing project. But he altered his itinerary to make a brief visit to the United States, to Philadelphia, the cultural capital of America, and to Washington, D.C., the new political capital. Even though he could write, quote, "I think only of preserving and publishing my manuscripts, how I long to be in Paris," Humboldt was determined to meet Thomas Jefferson first. He wrote the president from Philadelphia, "I happened to pass through this country on my way to France because of my intense interest in the human welfare of the United States, which resulted from your wise legislation and the civic virtues of your magistrates. After having witnessed the great spectacle of the majestic Andes and the grandeur of the physical world, I intended to enjoy the spectacle of a free people worthy of a great destiny. You, sir, who as a statesman exerted such a benevolent influence on this destiny, will, I pray, receive the expression of my respectful affection." President Jefferson was modestly familiar with Humboldt's activities. He replied to Humboldt's letter of self-introduction on May 28th, quote, "I offer you congratulations on your arrival here in good health, after a tour in the course of which you have been exposed to so many hardships and hazards." Jefferson said he was eager, quote, "to receive the information you will be able to give about Central and South America," and he made an uncharacteristically bold claim for his own place as America's most uncompromising advocate of enlightenment and the perfectibility of man. "No one," Jefferson wrote, "will feel the significance of your travels more strongly than myself, because no one perhaps views the New World with more partial hopes of its exhibiting an ameliorated state of the human condition." Bold words. In other words, yes, by all means visit Washington, D.C., but there was just one catch. Here, by the way, is Peale's Humboldt, and also Peale's silhouette that he made as souvenirs on the journey. Yes, by all means visit Washington, D.C., but there was one catch. Jefferson again. "In the new position in which the seat of our government is fixed, we have nothing curious to attract the observation of a traveler, and can only substitute in its place the welcome with which we should receive your visit, should you find it convenient to add so much to your journey. As the great Federalist bon vivant Gouverneur Morris put it of Washington, quote, "Indeed, it is a great city for future habitation. We only need here houses, cellars, kitchens, scholarly men, amiable women, and a few other such trifles to possess a perfect city." I'll return to this theme in a moment. Although Jefferson had been a principal advocate for capital removal, from the miasma of Williamsburg to Richmond in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and from New York and Philadelphia to the banks of the Potomac near Mount Vernon for the United States, and though Jefferson was himself apparently perfectly content in the District of Columbia, which he described, quote, as a very agreeable country residence, he knew that the new capital, he was the first to be inaugurated in Washington, had limited amenities and none of the cultural institutions and savants of Philadelphia. The president had to report to Humboldt that in contrast to Philadelphia, home of Peale's Museum, the Library Company, the College of Pennsylvania, and the American Philosophical Society, there was nothing much to do or see in the new capital. This may have been one of the few times that Thomas Jefferson experienced a whiff of regret about the creation of our national capital so far from the nation's population and cultural centers. After all, one of Jefferson's primary missions in life was to vindicate the beauty, the fecundity, and the magnificence of the New World against the animadversions of such old world commentators as the Comte de Buffon, who argued that the flora and fauna of America were inferior to their European counterparts, and it was even possible, said several European savants, that human stock degenerated in the cooler and moister climate of America. In part to counter this absurd notion, Jefferson had written his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, and convinced his American friends to hunt down and send him a moose carcass to Paris with which to vindicate America at Buffon's Jardin de Roy. The moose that Jefferson imported was what Iago in Othello called the ocular proof, Hal. Jefferson would not say this, of course, but the only value for Humboldt in venturing to Washington was, well, Thomas Jefferson, with the possible exception of James Madison on geopolitical questions involving the southwestern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, and Albert Gallatin, Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, a man of enormous curiosity and already something of an expert on American Indian languages. That said, let me find this slide for you. This is, by the way, this is Humboldt's customs baggage document from here. Here's his famous map, extraordinarily important map of New Spain. Here's Jefferson with his moose. It's a great story, which is worth exploring in its own right. Here's Humboldt's letter to Jefferson on arrival in French, and Jefferson's reply, and a close-up of that. And here's Jefferson's second letter asking for details about what we now call Texas. Here's the White House, more or less at that moment. No west wing, no east wing, no east or west portico. And here, sorry, it's acting up. Whoa. All right, I'll go back to my script. Could you just maybe shut it off for the moment? I don't know what happened. Anyway, you get the point. That said, that Washington had so few amenities, it is important to remember that the enlightened president had turned his office in what is now the state dining room of the White House into a serious cabinet of curiosities, with bookshelves, bird cages, maps, engravings, manuscripts, tools, scientific instruments, argand lamps, busts, a theodolite, globes, pots of plants, a camera obscura, his five-sided book stand, primitive word processing machines, and his pet mockingbird named Dick. Jefferson was no Philadelphia, but he was the next best thing in all of North America. He combined in one person some of the skills that appeared in more concentrated but isolated measure in such men as Caspar Wistar, Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Smith Barton, Charles Wilson Peale, Andrew Ellicott, and Robert Patterson, among others. Jefferson was not merely the President of the United States, a job he called splendid misery, but also still the President of America's most important cultural institution, the American Philosophical Society. After a week of meetings, dinners, and site tours with the intellectual leaders of Philadelphia, Humboldt made his way overland to Washington, D.C. with a party of 5 other men, led by the indefatigable Charles Wilson Peale, the closest of the Philadelphia elite to Mr. Jefferson. The Philosophic Party, as they called themselves, consisted of Peale, Humboldt, French botanist Aimé Bonpland, their traveling companion Carlos de Montufar, Nicholas Collin, the rector of the Swedish Church in Philadelphia, and Dr. Anthony Fothergill, an English physician who is now in temporary retirement in the United States. Altogether, Humboldt spent 44 days in the U.S., depending slightly on how you count. He spent 10 of those days in Washington, D.C. Just how many hours he spent with Jefferson is unclear, but between June 1st and June 10th, he seems to have spent some portion of nearly every day with the president at the White House. Jefferson was so friendly and so indifferent to formal protocol that Humboldt, who had originally wondered whether the chief magistrate of the U.S. would even be willing to greet him, was apparently permitted to drop in unannounced. On one occasion, according to Washington diarist Margaret Bayard Smith, quote, he found Mr. Jefferson seated on the floor, surrounded by half a dozen of his grandchildren, so eagerly and noisily engaged in a game of romps that for some moments his entrance was not perceived, and when his presence was discovered, Mr. Jefferson rose up, shaking hands with Humboldt, and said, quote, you have found me playing the fool, Baron, but I am sure to you I need make no apology. Jefferson's sole surviving daughter, Martha, was visiting from Charlottesville with several of her children. Humboldt dined at the White House a couple of times during his stay in the Capitol, but other members and friends of the administration, Dolly and James Madison, William and Anna Thornton, Samuel Harrison and Margaret Bayard Smith, and Albert and Hannah Gallatin, all took turns entertaining the Philadelphia contingent at their homes. It appears that President Jefferson did not venture from the White House to attend any of those afternoon or evening gatherings. Jefferson was a very private man who did not even attend the celebration ball for Meriwether Lewis on January 14, 1807, just returned from his own transcontinental trek, and Jefferson slipped away from his successor James Madison's inaugural ball in 1809 at the earliest decent opportunity. But we should remember, too, that in June of 1804, Jefferson was grieving for his daughter Maria. His younger of his 2 daughters had died on April 17, 1804, at Monticello at the age of 25. The first great blow of Jefferson's life was the death of his wife Martha on September 6, 1782, and in the months that followed, he had something approaching a nervous breakdown. The second greatest blow of his life was the death of his daughter Maria, Polly, just weeks before Humboldt arrived. To his old friend John Page, who had written a gentle letter of condolence, Jefferson acknowledged that his loss, quote, was great indeed. Others may lose of their abundance, but I of my want have lost even the half of all that I had. My evening prospects now hang on the slender thread of a single life, by which he meant his oldest and now only surviving daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph. From the depths of his loss, Jefferson added, quote, perhaps I may be destined to see even this last cord of parental affection broken. In fact, Martha would outlive her father by 10 years. Although Jefferson was a highly disciplined Stoic, seeking always to be impervious to either grief or ecstasy, he was still mourning when young Humboldt turned up in early June. Under the circumstances, it is not all surprising that he declined the invitations for dinners for this remarkable young man, hosted by some of his closest friends and allies. Nevertheless, Jefferson was at the height of his career in the summer of 1804. Early indications pointed to his certain re-election to the presidency later that year, though Jefferson could not then know that his reelection would be a landslide and he would carry all but 2 states in the Electoral College, Connecticut and Delaware. He already enjoyed a friendly Congress, and by the end of the year, his Democratic Republicans would have overwhelming majorities in both houses. America was at peace. More importantly, the world was at peace. The brief interruption in the Napoleonic Wars that reignited in 1805 and bedeviled his second term. The die-hard Federalists, who had warned that Jefferson's ascent to the presidency would bring on moral bankruptcy, a new world reign of terror, had now mostly calmed down. They realized that no matter how much they detested Jefferson and regarded him as a Jacobin, an atheist, and what Alexander Hamilton called an intellectual voluptuary, the best kind, I think, by the way. If you have to be a voluptuary, you want to be an intellectual voluptuary. Jefferson had pursued a decidedly moderate course as the nation's first magistrate, had retained a majority of Federalist office holders, had not confiscated the nation's Bibles, had not dismantled Mr. Hamilton's financial system, or repudiated the national debt. Jefferson had been right about the dearth of cultural interests in the new raw capital. But Humboldt and his traveling party made the best of what was available. They visited Capitol Hill, where Humboldt was permitted to climb to the top of the unfinished Capitol building to survey the surrounding countryside to maximum advantage. According to one Humboldt biographer, when he was taken to the highest point on Capitol Hill and pointed out the shining river rolling between its picturesque verdant banks, he said it was the most beautiful panorama that he had ever seen. They visited the fledgling Congressional Library, not yet the magnificent Library of Congress made possible when Jefferson sold his extraordinary private library to the government in 1815 after the British burned the nation's more narrowly focused Congressional Legal Library. They spent afternoons at the studio of American painter Gilbert Stuart, among other things pressing him to complete his portrait of Joseph Priestley, which, like most Stuart projects, was languishing. They made a pilgrimage to Mount Vernon to pay respect to America's and liberty's greatest hero. The Humboldt party wandered about the quiet estate, already a national shrine, and Humboldt may have had a conversation with Washington's enslaved valet, Billy Lee. Martha Washington had been dead for 2 years at the time of Humboldt's visit, George Washington for 7. They visited the Navy Yard, where Humboldt inspected armaments and boarded one of the frigates being fitted out for America's war against the Islamic pirates of Tripoli. He toured the fledgling U.S. Patent Office, where William Thornton served as the Commissioner of Patents in addition to his role as the architect of the Capitol. Nevertheless, before we bring these two great men of the Enlightenment together, the Prussian explorer and that patron of American exploration, Jefferson, it might be useful to remind ourselves again of just how primitive Washington, D.C. was at this time. Historian Andrea Wolf's description of the White House alone is interesting. Quote, "There were workmen's sheds and dirt in what should have been a presidential garden. The grounds were divided from the neighboring fields only by a rotting fence on which Jefferson's washerwoman dried the presidential laundry in full view. Inside the White House, the situation wasn't much better, as many rooms were only half furnished. Jefferson inhabited, as one visitor remarked, only one corner of the mansion, with the rest of it still in a state of uncleanly desolation." One unimpressed newspaper declared that the unfinished 23-room White House was, quote, "big enough for 2 emperors, 1 pope, and the Grand Lama in the bargain." Neither the north nor south porticos existed. Early in his first term, even Jefferson reported to his daughter that, quote, "Captain Lewis and myself are like 2 mice in a church." They were the only 2 white individuals sharing the cavernous dwelling, still plagued by a leaking roof. As they planned the new national capital, the district's commissioners reported that they had found 372 dwellings they described as habitable, but as one cabinet officer put it, most of them were small, miserable huts. A Federalist editor in Philadelphia, perhaps exhibiting sour grapes, declared, quote, "The federal city is in reality neither town nor village. It may be compared to a country seat where state sportsmen may run horses and fight cocks." And it said, "There sits the president like a pelican in the wilderness or a sparrow upon a housetop." When Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, a Jefferson friend and ally, took up his duties in the federal capital, he wrote his wife Hannah, "Our local situation is far from being pleasing or even convenient. There are around the capital," he wrote, "one tailor, one shoemaker, one printer, a washing woman, a grocery shop, a pamphlets and stationery store, a small dry goods shop, an oyster house. That makes the whole of the federal city." Federalist Representative Roger Griswold of Connecticut called the capital both melancholy and ludicrous, a city in ruins. Jefferson, of course, expressed a typically bucolic attitude. There is, he said, quote, "good society and enough of it, and free from the heat, the stench, and the bustle of a close-built town." The simple fact is that over the past 5 years, Humboldt had spent ample time in much more cosmopolitan, cultured, and stimulating cities all over the northern provinces of South America and Central America, including Mexico City, which then had a population of 70,000. Jefferson's Washington, D.C. was a wilderness and a construction zone with a very small population fronting the Potomac River. Gallatin said, "Every member of Congress detested Washington without a single exception, but it symbolized for Jefferson a novus ordo saeculorum." Fortunately for Humboldt, the prize was Thomas Jefferson. The Philosophic Party no sooner checked into Stell's Hotel than Peel, the president's friend, hurried over to the White House to announce their arrival and learn when Jefferson intended to see Humboldt and whether there would be a dinner in the Prussian explorer's honor. Peel rushed back to Stell's to announce that they had been granted an immediate audience with the president. That was June 4th, 1804. We know almost nothing about that meeting, which may have been little more than a series of introductions and reunions. We need to remember that this was the early 19th century, when even in America, many social encounters unfolded like a scene in a Jane Austen novel. We know that President Jefferson invited them all back for one of his signature afternoon dinners the following day. Our best source for what followed over the next 10 days is the diary of Charles Willson Peel. It is a valuable resource for historians, but unfortunately, it pays more attention to Peel's personal concerns than to the historic encounter between Jefferson and Humboldt. Eleanor Jones Harvey has written, quote, "Peel's diary is simultaneously the most complete account of Humboldt's trip and the most vexing. Peel often leaves the reader wondering about the substance of the conversations he witnessed among Humboldt and the scientists and statesmen that he met," unquote. In Peel's diary, we learn of his trouble with his dentures, which broke at the worst possible time, his annoyance at the drinking habits of several of his companions, his interest in lobbying Jefferson to move Peel's museum to Washington, D.C., and underwrite it with federal funding, and the improvements he had made to the polygraph, the latest model of which he brought to present to the president. In fairness, it should be noted that Jefferson was obsessed with the polygraph, invented by Philadelphia's John Isaac Hawkins. Jefferson suggested improvements to the mechanism, ordered versions with slight adjustments the way we insist on the latest cell phone, and rhapsodized that it was, quote, "the finest invention of the present age." He said he would have given anything to have the polygraph as early as 1776 to keep a thorough record of the transactions of the Revolution. I'm fine. Such is Peel's diary. All one can say is, where's James Boswell when we need him? When Boswell first met Dr. Samuel Johnson at London Bookshop in 1763, he had already developed a method for returning to his digs late at night and writing down what he could remember of the day's conversations. By sheer concentration and practice, Boswell had developed the capacity to remember and transcribe whole conversations with extraordinary accuracy, often involving up to a dozen men and some women, a talent even more impressive when we factor in Boswell's heavy consumption of alcohol. This great voyeuristic skill enabled Boswell to keep one of the world's most remarkable journals, and later to write what is widely considered the greatest biography in the English language, The Life of Samuel Johnson, LL.D., published in 1791, just 13 years before Humboldt ventured to the U.S. Charles Wilson Peale was no Boswell. He provides a good deal of important detail, but the most he says of the conversations he overheard comes the day after the president's White House dinner for Humboldt. This is his report. What pleased me much, not a single toast was given or called for, or politics touched on, but the subjects of natural history and improvements of the conveniences of life, manners of different nations described, or other agreeable conversation animated the whole company. Arg. Just what subjects of natural history were discussed? Which improvements to daily life? What manners of different nations were included in the meeting? And what the other agreeable conversation included? We are not informed. I think it is fair to say we would give almost anything to have a transcript of the presidential dinner party of June 5th, 1804. Still, if ever two men of the Enlightenment were destined to hit it off, they were Humboldt and Jefferson. A full decade later, Jefferson would address a letter to Humboldt with the words, quote, "My dear friend and baron," a rare expression of affection that Jefferson did not exhibit even with John Adams or James Madison. As a patron of half a dozen exploration missions into the American interior, not all of which got off the ground, and someone deeply, even profoundly fascinated by the uncharted lands of the Americas, Jefferson must have listened to Humboldt's accounts of his travels with rapt attention. The two polymaths also shared a number of core principles. They both believed in the free exchange of ideas. Like Jefferson, historian Ingo Schwartz writes, Humboldt was convinced that the sciences should be free and the exchange of information should not be limited. Traveling under a Spanish passport with the official imprimatur of Spain's King Carlos IV, Humboldt revealed to Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin detailed information about Mexico and New Spain that another explorer might have regarded as a state secret and withheld from the eager eyes of Spain's New World adversary, the United States. And I should just digress here for a moment to say that Spain sent out 4 intercept missions to cut off Lewis and Clark. They were so paranoid about Texas, Arizona, and California that they sent 4 military missions to cut off the Lewis and Clark expedition. And here, Humboldt was traveling with a Spanish passport, and he freely divulged extraordinarily important geopolitical information to Jefferson. They both were advocates of a republican form of government. Humboldt's early enthusiasm for the French Revolution had soured with the Reign of Terror and the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. He now believed that the United States stood alone as the world's exemplum of enlightened self-government. Even in the last years of his life, Humboldt would declare, "I am half American." In his May 24th letter to Jefferson, he said he wanted to get to know, quote, "a people which understands the precious gift of liberty." They were both fascinated by what came to be called the science of paleontology, with a special interest in incognita, as they called them, what in his famous instructions to Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson called, quote, "the animals not known in the U.S., the remains and accounts of any which may be deemed rare or extinct." Jefferson had presented his memoir on the Megalonyx, or Great Claw, to the American Philosophical Society on February 10th, 1797. And by the way, I saw the bones from that talk today. And it was one of the most thrilling moments of my life. They pulled a shelf out, and there were the bones from the Megalonyx. You don't get that in North Dakota. Plenty of bones. Jefferson was not altogether sure that the mammoth or mastodon did not still graze somewhere in the western wilderness of America. In fact, in the 250-word blank vocabulary chart he had printed up for Captain Lewis, Jefferson listed mammoth after milk, egg, and house, and before buffalo, elk, and deer on his chart, hoping, I suppose, that the Lakota or the Nez Perce or the Shoshone would not only understand what mammoth meant, but offer up a native language equivalent. Think about this for a minute. How do you ask a Nez Perce leader using sign language if his people know of a very, very, very large quadruped with gigantic tusks, roughly like an elephant, only much larger? And for that matter, how do you communicate the idea of an elephant to a people who have never seen or heard of one? No wonder the Federalists made fun of Jefferson's credulity. They both deplored the Comte de Buffon's degeneracy theory. They both loved trees. Already in 1804, Humboldt was fretting about the effect of deforestation on climate, and Jefferson once told his friend Margaret Bayard Smith that he regarded the unnecessary cutting down of a tree equivalent to murder. I suppose the correct technical term is silvicide. They both believed that an idea once discovered belongs immediately to humankind, and the discoverer or uncoverer of that idea or object should be honored, but not receive much more than modest intellectual property protection. Jefferson famously said, quote, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me." One of the greatest of all Jefferson's statements. And so on. Jefferson was a famous collector of protégés. Here, in some ways, was the very best of them. Like Meriwether Lewis, Humboldt was young enough to qualify as a surrogate son. We know some of the conversations Jefferson and Humboldt had, and we can speculate about others. We know they talked extensively about what is now Texas. We know they talked about longitude. Jefferson had developed his own technique for determining longitude, which he thought he had discovered. Jefferson's method did not require a chronometer. It was cumbersome. Unfortunately, he trained Meriwether Lewis in that method. And most of the serious surveyors and experts in celestial navigation in the US and Europe politely disagreed with Jefferson's approach. Humboldt informed the president that the no chronometer method antedated Jefferson's longitudinal experiments and was actually quite well known in European circles. Jefferson cheerfully accepted this revelation and dropped his previous claim that he had discovered the method himself. We can be sure they talked about mammoths and mastodons, because Humboldt had written in his letter of introduction on May 24, 1804, that he was eager to discuss this subject with the celebrated author of Notes on Virginia. While staying in Bogota, preparing to climb up through the Andes, Humboldt had visited the Field of Giants, Campo de Gigantes, to examine mastodon bones. He said, quote, "I would love to talk with you about a subject you have treated so ingeniously in your work on Virginia, the mammoth teeth which we discovered in the Andes in the southern hemisphere at 11,000 feet above the feet of the Pacific Ocean." 11,000 feet. It's hard to imagine any subject more certain to get Jefferson's full attention than this. His obsession with mammoths, mastodons, the megalonyx, and other prehistoric quadrupeds was so intense that the word mammoth became a kind of running tagline among Jefferson's friends and especially his detractors. Humboldt had read Jefferson's notes in Europe, so he knew that Jefferson had an interest in the mammoth and mastodon, but he could not have known that Jefferson's fascination, coupled with his deeply acquisitive nature, amounted to a combination of high-minded natural philosophy and something akin to today's children's fascination with velociraptors and Tyrannosaurus rex. What Humboldt reported to Jefferson must have both fascinated him and, to use a slang term, blown his mind. If in Notes on Virginia, Jefferson had been filled with wonder at the presence of fossil seashells, or what appeared to be seashells atop mountains, imagine how he reacted to Humboldt's assurance that he had found mammoth teeth himself at 10,870 feet. Whatever else was true, Jefferson knew that mammoths or mastodons could not possibly have grazed at so high an altitude. So their fossilized teeth evidently got there in some other way. Just how, he could not be sure, no Humboldt either, though by the time he reached the White House, Humboldt had jettisoned the early Neptunist geologic theory and accepted volcanism, what we might call plate tectonics, with all of its attendant phenomena. which would posit that the strata where Humboldt found those teeth had once been in a valley thousands of feet below its current location. It appears, too, that Humboldt and Jefferson talked about the desirability of a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. And very likely, they talked about European misunderstandings or misrepresentations of the New World. It's hard to believe that Jefferson did not tell Humboldt about his great moose stunt. It seems likely, too, that at some point Jefferson would have urged Humboldt to linger in the New World longer. Jefferson was in the habit of declaring to Europeans that it was worth a trip across the Atlantic to see or paint the Natural Bridge in Western Virginia, Harper's Ferry, where the Shenandoah and the Potomac conflow, and of course Niagara Falls, which Jefferson extolled but never himself visited. Humboldt arrived in the U.S. just as the Lewis and Clark expedition was embarking on its 28-month, 7,689-mile reconnaissance of the American West. Authorized by Congress in the spring of 1803 and granted a solid appropriation of $2,500, the Corps of Volunteers for Northwestern Discovery was led by one of Mr. Jefferson's protégés, Meriwether Lewis, who grew up within sight of Monticello. In the spring of 1801, Jefferson had chosen Lewis to serve as his private secretary in the White House. Lewis trained for this epic journey at the feet of the sage of Monticello, but also, as you know, among key figures of the American Enlightenment here in Philadelphia, Benjamin Smith Barton, Benjamin Rush, and Robert Patterson, among others. In a well-known passage in the expedition's journals dated April 7, 1805, Lewis would compare himself humbly to Christopher Columbus of the 15th century and Captain James Cook of the 18th. It is unlikely that Lewis knew then of the existence of Alexander von Humboldt. On June 4, 1804, Humboldt and Lewis were separated by 940 miles. It is fascinating to speculate about what might have happened if the Lewis and Clark expedition had begun 1 year later, after Humboldt's visit to Philadelphia. I feel certain that Jefferson would have put the two young men together for long talks. Humboldt was born in 1769, Lewis in 1774. If Humboldt and Lewis had spent time together, the Lewis and Clark expedition could only have benefited. Humboldt, who is usually regarded as the father of ecology, would have encouraged Lewis to see the wilderness through the lens of interconnectivity. He would have urged Lewis to pay special attention to the comparative elevation of plants, including flowers, grasses, and trees. He certainly would have given Lewis rigorous training in longitude, which would have lifted the expedition's science portfolio considerably. He would have had plenty to say about the sort of vessels that would be needed to safely navigate the powerful rivers of the Americas. His curious and generous view of indigenous peoples, with his conviction that they were not inherently inferior, just different, might have inspired Lewis to look on his native peoples with less condescension. Humboldt might have been able to teach Lewis to make competent drawings of elevated landscapes. He could certainly have taught Lewis the best methods of pressing plants and preserving them properly over long distances under wilderness conditions. Humboldt's belief that an expedition wasn't really over until all of its findings were published might have convinced Lewis that he needed to keep extremely detailed and continuous journals. Lewis is missing for 441 days of the journey, with an eye to their subsequent reworking and publication. Because Humboldt had been trained as a mining engineer, he might have been able to provide Lewis important clues about gold deposits, silver, lead, and salt. He would have explained to Lewis what he knew or had learned about the river systems of what would become the American Southwest. And if he had met Lewis in time, he might have taught the American explorer the use of the barometer in determining the altitude of mountains. Now, I won't go into details. I know our time is running short, but let me just say this. If they had met, if Lewis had begun a year later, if Humboldt had come a year earlier, it's not altogether out of the realm of possibility that he would have asked to join the expedition. And just think for a moment what that would have meant. Great news for science, maybe something less for the reputation in American memory of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I've written a long piece here about this, but I will pass by it for the moment. When Humboldt returned to Europe, he published 30 volumes. No Enlightenment figure, with the possible exception of Buffon, ever wrote so much or so proficiently. And as I think you know, Meriwether Lewis never published a single volume. In his defense, it should be said that Jefferson misplaced and misused him after his return from the West at the end of 1806. Several of the intellectual leaders of Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. urged Humboldt to remain in America and publish his exploration reports here. But the simple truth is that the United States, including even Philadelphia, did not then possess the publication infrastructure, cartographers, engravers, editors, illustrators, etc., that would have been necessary to produce such volumes. All right, so I want to just close here by turning to an issue that we can't ignore. America had a love affair with Humboldt. Everyone said that he talked a mile a minute, he spoke in 4 languages, he chattered, he overwhelmed people with his eloquence and his information, that they couldn't get a word in edgewise, but he was utterly fascinating. But the one subject that did not come up was, guess what? Slavery. In the many hours he spent at the president's house, Humboldt could not have failed to be aware of Jefferson's hopelessly complicated relationship with slavery. When Jefferson took up residence in the White House in March of 1801, he brought as many as 11 enslaved men and women with him from Monticello to maintain the house and attend to his needs. Here was the author of the celebrated Declaration of Independence, blithely going about his business and entertaining Humboldt and the cream of the American Enlightenment, while enslaved African-American men and women served at table, made the beds, washed dishes and clothes, cooked meals, took care of horses, and emptied and scoured chamber pots. The philosophic party that visited Jefferson in the Capitol was uniformly made up of abolitionists, none more ardent than Humboldt himself. Humboldt could not have failed to note this whopping paradox. He never even tried to accept Jefferson's self-serving formulation that slavery had been imposed upon us by the British and the Dutch, and now, though we wanted to do the right thing, we were paralyzed, like having the wolf by the ears. And yet, it seems very unlikely that the subject was ever raised at the president's round dining table. The historian Sandra Reebok has puzzled over this issue and concluded, quote, "It seems strange that 2 such illustrious public intellectuals would fail to address this issue. No record of any discussion remains." Humboldt, she says, quote, "likely realized that broaching such a controversial issue with the President of the United States might make for an uncomfortable encounter." Jefferson had the capacity to convince the men and women around him that he was a principled emancipationist who was just stuck in a difficult situation, but who should be seen almost as a victim of the slave economy. Jefferson specialized in issuing blandly high-minded statements in his letters about the inevitability that slavery would end soon, perhaps in the next generation, that nobody wished more than he did for the extirpation of this abominable institution, that when the moment came when he could do something not counterproductive, but decisive on the issue, he was poised to do the right thing. The amazing thing about this carefully modulated posture, which allowed Jefferson to have it both ways, was that it convinced most of his friends that he was on their side, in their camp, of their persuasion. And at the same time, this narrative permitted Jefferson to continue to benefit from a large enslaved community both in Washington and in several Virginia plantations, as thoroughly as the most ardent defenders of the institution of slavery. Humboldt saved his vitriol about slavery until he was leaving, and then in a letter to William Thornton, who did not own enslaved people. In fact, the British warned Thornton was one of the most outspoken critics of slavery in America. To Thornton, Humboldt wrote, "This abominable law that permits the importation of Negroes is a disgrace for a state in which I know many level-headed people live, conforming to the only course of action dictated by humanity," in other words, ending slavery. Undoubtedly, less cotton will be exported at first, but alas, how I detest this politics that measures and evaluates the public welfare simply according to the value of its exports. The wealth of nations is like the wealth of individuals. It is only secondary to our happiness. Before one is free, one must be just, and without justice, there is no lasting prosperity. Think of the wisdom of that remark. So I don't want to conclude on that note. I want to conclude on a slightly different note. My last page. Humboldt and Jefferson formed a strong and affectionate friendship that summer in the White House. Thereafter, they exchanged letters on a range of subjects right up to the end of Jefferson's life in 1826. This much by way of conclusion. Remember, Humboldt had wondered if the Chief Magistrate of the United States would grant him an audience. Instead, he encountered an unpretentious farmer president who eschewed pomp and circumstance, and that magistrate became an instant and lifelong admirer and friend of Humboldt. A few years later, Humboldt was presented to Napoleon Bonaparte in Paris. Napoleon said to him, "I understand you collect plants, monsieur." Humboldt confirmed the description, and then Napoleon said, "So does my wife," and turned away. That's the difference. Thank you so much. Okay. Do we have some time? Okay. You're so very kind. There was so much more I wanted to say, but Hal's introduction, it just, all the world's a stage, Hal. I guess we have time for a few questions. I know it's hot in here, but let's take a few questions if you have them. Who would like to begin? There's one back
microphone for you.
Here we go.
You have it? One of the things about Humboldt is how driven he was. I mean, I forget how many books you mentioned. He published 30 or 40. It seemed like he was working all the time. And can you just say a little bit about Humboldt, the individual, separate from science, his personal life? Did he have one, or was he just working all the time and there was no distinction?
He was working all the time. There was no distinction. Humboldt's joy was being out there. He claimed to one of his hosts here in Philadelphia that he'd never been 6 months in one place in his life. He went back to France after this. He never came back to the U.S. He worked in Paris mostly, although he spent time in Berlin too, and he published 40 or 50 volumes, 30 on this journey. So 30-volume report on the 5 years that he spent in South America and in Mexico. His personal life was uncertain. He never married. He had passionate friendships with men. I'm not suggesting necessarily that they were sexualized, but he was a kind of a loner, happiest when he was either writing, and if you're a writer, you know that's sitting in a room 12 hours a day with pen and paper, and happiest when he was exploring. And he went on to explore parts of Russia, much of Europe. He was indefatigable. And so for most explorers, once you've done something like that, you settle into a life of celebrity. That was never the case with Humboldt. And so when we look at him in the 21st century, he's, especially among you, known, but not particularly well known. 100 years ago, he was one of the best known people in the world. And his reputation has come down in the last century, and it's not quite clear what that means. Father of ecology, discovered the Humboldt current, creator of plant geography, inventor of isotherms. He's a universal genius. Emerson said such a person comes along once every millennium. And more places are named after Humboldt than any other figure in human history. A lot of them by John C. Fremont, who adored his work. Darwin carried copies of Humboldt with him on the Beagle. His place in the history of exploration is not as large as it ought to be. And I think that there are books yet to be written. Andrea Wolf's book, The Invention of Nature, is outstanding. There are others. But more books need to be written. And I think one needs to be written about the Jefferson-Humboldt relationship. There is one, but I think a better book could be written. There's a question back here. I hope that answers your question.
So Clay, first of all, outstanding, as usual.
Oh, thank you.
What were Humboldt's source of funds for these extraordinary undertakings that were like years and years, okay, in different venues, different currencies, unless he traveled with gold all the time or whatever? I mean, how did he fund this undertaking?
He self-funded it. He traveled more or less alone. So Lewis and Clark had a party of 33. The total cost of their expedition was $38,750 or something, although the congressional appropriation had been $2,500. That's not just cost overrun. There was an assumption that they would be able to get in-kind services from military supplies and at Harper's Ferry and from forts and military installations throughout the country. He was moderately wealthy. He self-funded this. He traveled alone with Bonpland and gathered guides and liaisons in the course of his travels. He never seems to have been out of money, so his funding was secure. He was trying to circumambulate, well, at least circumnavigate the globe, and only chance kept him from doing that between 1799 and 1804. He was on his way back to France to regroup. He had 40 crates of artifacts and papers that he was taking back. He wanted to get them safely to Paris, which was then the European intellectual capital of the world, and then he was going to go back out and see the rest of the world, and it just didn't happen at that time. So he was lucky to be able to self-fund these journeys. Other questions? I saw a couple more.
Clay, so 900 miles, he could have caught up, right, with Lewis. Maybe he could expand a bit more about, was he too busy? Was this the beginning, middle of a trip, or what?
Well, 900 miles is a long way, then especially. So I have a whole section in this talk which is much longer than this about that. And so Lewis and Clark traveled a distance of 485.9 miles during this 44-day period. They were traveling about 11 miles per day. There's a very funny story about this because I was contrasting music. So there's a story about the Thorntons entertaining Humboldt, and Charles Wilson Peale says that Anna Thornton sang after dinner. So think of a Jane Austen novel. She sang songs in French, Italian, and English, and he said she sang them in a very high style. I'm no sarcast, but that sounds like she was belting it out. And at the same time, out on the Lewis and Clark expedition, they had fiddle music and were playing Virginia reels and frontier music. And I just asked in this essay, who do you think had a better evening? Being in that drawing room or being out on the Lewis and Clark Trail with their extraordinary exuberance. You know, Lewis said that sometimes the men would work from dawn until dusk as hard as human physical endurance could push the boats, 5 miles, 8 miles, maybe 12 miles on a good day. And then they would set up latrines and tents and build the evening cooking fires and put out guards around the perimeter and then eat venison of some sort. And then Lewis said, and then the men would sing and dance for 4 or 5 hours in the evening under the moon. He said, I can't understand where the physical energy comes from because they're absolutely exhausted at the end of the day. And so there's this kind of sense of, that's what the book I would write is that, you know, what's going on the trail and what's going on in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. and the contrast in this. But I think that if the timing had been better and the chance had presented itself that Humboldt could travel with Lewis and Clark, I think Jefferson might have said no. You know, he wanted to create an empire for liberty, such as the world has never previously seen, to use his term. And I think he might have regarded that as a little dicey from a geopolitical standpoint. But remember that Humboldt was traveling with a Spanish passport and under the direct leadership of King Carlos IV. And so Jefferson was edgy about Spain, and I think he might have wanted to protect his favorite protege, Lewis. But, you know, what we lost in the great, you know, James Ronda once said that the Lewis and Clark expedition is America's first great road story. What we would lose in that, we would have gained in pure science. And just imagine what Humboldt would have been able to provide. He climbed 20,000 feet. Lewis and Clark's highest ascent was 7,300 feet, although we've done it and it's horrible. Humboldt brought 60,000 plants back, Lewis about 200. Humboldt got to Acapulco in Mexico, and he immediately recognized that it was off by 5 degrees of longitude on maps. He published his findings, and they were immediately accepted by the cartographical world. Lewis's longitude was never made sense of after he returned. And so we're talking about, a supreme scientific genius, one of the great men of history, and then a really gifted amateur like Meriwether Lewis, and how that would have mingled, if it could have mingled, is a really interesting story. But it would have, my point is, it would have, and I've written about this in We Proceeded On. You should subscribe to this. It's the Lewis and Clark Quarterly. But I wrote about it in this issue. The question is the Enlightenment or the road story. And the Lewis and Clark story is so much an American adventure story that its science is subordinated to that. If Humboldt had been along, the science would have dominated, and Lewis and Clark would have been their military escort. And so a completely different sort of journey. Maybe one or two more. Here's one.
I'm going to go to Dan.
Okay, yeah, I trust you.
From online.
Yes, we have a question from our streaming audience. How long after a return from an expedition did Humboldt typically publish his findings?
It took decades. And he got right on it and started publishing before the decade was out. So it gets back to Paris in 1804, and his publications begin in that decade, and then he just kept at it. He had all these findings, and so what Lewis had planned to do was to hand all this stuff over to Benjamin Smith Barton and others to do the scientific analysis. Lewis was just bringing back the data. He didn't have the capacity to do the things that Humboldt then went on to do. And so Humboldt began publishing every couple of years. 1, 2, 3 books would come out. Now, these were not all gigantic books, but they were all very significant. And there's nothing that he touched that he didn't excel at. He carried more than 40 scientific instruments with him to South America, including a cyanometer. You know what that is? It's the greatest thing. Look it up. It's a disc that has all the shades of blue, and you would look at the sky and decide which of the shades of blue the sky where you were was. A cyanometer. You've got to have one. He had no problem writing. So there are 2 problems with Lewis and writing. They were gone for 862 days, and Lewis's journals are missing for 441 days, more than half. And we know that he didn't write those journals. It's not that they were lost in boat accidents. Secondly, when Lewis got back, he never wrote the book. Jefferson said, sit down and write out your 3-volume report, and Lewis never did. When Lewis killed himself, or probably killed himself on October 11th, 1809, Jefferson got a letter from the publishers here in Philadelphia, and they said, we have written Lewis repeatedly. We've never received a single page or a single line of his report. And so, the last person you want to be the leader of such a command is someone who can't write, who has writer's block, for whatever reason that is. I have a whole book on this called The Character of Meriwether Lewis, which I invite you to read, trying to figure out what happened. And there's a key chapter called Lewis and Silence. And I think I have a theory of how the silence works. But the fact is, Lewis let Jefferson down, he let the country down, he let the Enlightenment down. And because of that, I just want to dwell on this for one moment. Lewis is dead, the journals are unpublished, the publisher doesn't have any idea what's going on. Jefferson calls Clark into Monticello. Jefferson didn't know Clark very well and didn't think particularly highly of him. And he said, you take care of this. Well, Clark, if you've ever read the journals, is one of the worst spellers in the history of the English language, and not a grammarian either. And so he knew he couldn't do it. So he came here, and he had to go around town saying, were there illustrators? Is Barton working on the science? Who was going to publish this? Who's doing the maps? And so they cobbled it together, and they hired Nicholas Biddle as a ghostwriter, as a man of letters, and Biddle did a superb job, but it's a paraphrase of the adventure story. And Biddle actually took the original journals with a red pencil and X'd out the science. That was going to be done by Barton. Barton never did it. So what we have is a great American adventure story called Lewis and Clark with a modicum of science instead of a scientific Enlightenment expedition that was what Jefferson had in mind. And so you have to say Jefferson chose poorly. I mean, he couldn't know that Lewis wouldn't write, but he did know and reported that Lewis suffered from depression. And so why Lewis sort of flamed out and didn't do this important thing is a mystery, but it's a tragedy for American science and for Lewis, because he would have been regarded in the same sentence, at least with Audubon, had he lived to publish all that he had discovered. And so it's a terrible thing. And I'm a great lover of Lewis, don't get me wrong. But when you start to look at Humboldt, you realize, oh, that's what it's supposed to look like.
One of the themes of the new exhibition on the history of climate science in the APS Museum is that Jefferson seemed to think that human habitation would truly improve the environment, while Humboldt was seriously skeptical about that. I'm curious to know what your view is of that, of those two notions.
Jefferson is a paradox in so many ways, as you know. He was deeply enamored of a kind of a Horatian, Virgilian agrarianism. This is an agrarianism that doesn't exist in the world. It exists in Virgil. It exists in Horace. And so Jefferson had in mind, and I know it sounds like I'm joking, that we would have a republic of family farmers who worked modestly hard in the fields by day and read Homer in the original Greek at night. And you think, well, how's that working out, Mr. Jefferson? But this is what he thought. I mean, you cannot deny that Jefferson was consumed by this idea that we would be an agrarian republic. And he knew that the minute we ceased to be an agrarian republic, all bets were off. And so how Jefferson could have held this vision on a plantation where there were hundreds of enslaved people, and knowing that his fellow Virginians were slashing and burning the environment as fast as they could extract wealth from it and from human flesh, is a paradox. But Jefferson early on sort of imbibed this ancient Virgilian idea, and he imposed it on the country, and we still live with it. We still privilege family farming. And I'm from North Dakota, where that's almost our mission statement. Jefferson wrote in Notes on Virginia, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God," if ever he had a chosen people. And he meant it. He's a plantation owner who's talking about the chosen people of God. And you just think, what kind of cognitive dissonance could Jefferson contain within his mighty poetic brain? So Humboldt had seen the effect of colonialism in a way that Jefferson chose not to, let's say. And Humboldt believed in raw nature in a way that Jefferson didn't. And yet, on the other hand, Jefferson's effectively the father of the national park system, and he bought the Natural Bridge. And there's no way you can ever pin Jefferson down very easily on any of these subjects. But if I had longer time, I would have said this. I don't think that Jefferson really listened to Humboldt much except about Mexico. He was really concerned about the southwestern boundary of the United States. And the Spanish were saying that it was the Sabine River, the boundary today between Louisiana and Texas. And the U.S. was saying it was the Rio Grande River. That means Texas. And he kept asking Humboldt, what do you know about it? Who lives there? How dense is the population? Is the land fertile? Would it be useful to us? Will they contest it if we try to take it? He was thinking in geopolitical terms, which as a president of the United States, he should have been thinking. But Humboldt, as this kind of man filled with knowledge about his travels and observations on indigenous peoples and observations on colonialism, I think Jefferson was not particularly attuned to that in the summer of 1804, and partly, I think, because he was grieving the death of his daughter, which was a tremendous blow to him. So we're out of time. I'm taking it. I'm so sorry. As you can probably guess, I would just go on and on. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Clay.
Thank you.
And thank all of you. Clay has agreed to sign some copies of one of his books we have out in back. If you have any unasked questions, that may provide you with an opportunity. Otherwise, I want to thank you again and thank our hosts here at the American Philosophical Society for hosting us for tonight's dinner, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you, and good night.